You might have seen a list of 10 writing rules making the rounds on social media lately. This is a list made by Elmore Leonard, who's written a number of crime and suspense novels, of which I've read a few and they're quite good. But with any list of writing rules, we're going to look at it with a side eye and interrogate it and see which ones of these are bunk and which ones have a grain of truth. 1. Never open a book with weather. Now, when we writers hear the word never, it rankles us, right? We're just like, I'm gonna do it just to see if I can. And plus, we always think of exceptions as well. I mean, there are dozens of books that you know and have read that start with weather. I mean, look at Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. Does it start with weather? Why, yes. Yes, it does. I think the question really is, if you want to start with weather, how do you do it well? I think this is the secret. You appear to start with weather and then transition quickly into the storyline. Look at this example by George Orwell in 1984. It was a bright, cold day in April and the clocks were striking 13. Yes, it starts with weather. It's a very bright, cold day. But the fact that the clocks are striking 13 immediately lets you know, like, this is not a world that I'm familiar with. Or take Stephen Crane, The Red Badge of Courage. The cold passed slowly from the earth and the lifting dawn revealed an army stretched across the hills, resting. Yes, it starts with the cold weather and dawn approaching, but really the information in the sentence that we care about is that there's an army. So something's going to happen. I think the only way I'd agree with Elmore Leonard in this case is if he's talking about starting the book with an entire paragraph all about the weather. Okay, yeah, that's pretty tough to pull off. But to mention the weather alongside like the more plot-based stuff, I think you can get away with it. 2. Avoid prologues. I think this is genre-dependent advice. If you're writing literary fiction or upmarket fiction, then yeah, I mean, it's probably a bad idea to start with a prologue. But if you're writing fantasy or historical or thrillers or horror, well, I think the rules are a little different. In Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett, that starts with a prologue and there's a hanging in the prologue and a curse is uttered and that curse ends up impacting the rest of the narrative. Lord of the Rings starts with a prologue. Game of Thrones starts with a prologue. I think my point is there are definitely ways to do prologues well. And so if you choose to go that route, here are 3 pieces of advice. I would recommend having your prologue focus on a minor character, especially if they end up dying. 2. Prologues often happen in a time period before the main story, sometimes even in a different place. And 3, use your prologue to establish the genre. If you start off with a very action-based scene, it buys you some time to allow you to set up the story a little bit before you get back to the exciting parts. Elmore Leonard's 3rd rule is never use a verb other than said to carry dialogue. Basically, he's talking about dialogue tags saying like it should be he said or she said, and not something like he exclaimed or she muttered. I have fought wars with people over dialogue tags, not because I wanted to fight, because I said something and like people were like, no, I do not believe that. It got nasty. First, let's start with where I disagree with him. I can debunk with a single example, right? Sometimes you need to say, she whispered. There's not really any other way to communicate a whisper in dialogue other than just by saying she whispered. So that belongs to the category of volume changes. That can be a very useful way to use different dialogue tags. Now, this is where I partially agree with him. There are dialogue tags like she replied, he asked, he added. Now, are those the worst things ever? No. I mean, they're pretty innocuous dialogue tags as dialogue tags go. But do you absolutely need them? Well, no. She replied, I mean, it's obvious that she's replying. There's another line of dialogue just before that. Or even something like he added. I mean, it's obvious that he's adding to something he just said. I mean, there was probably a line of his dialogue just before that. Or a dialogue tag like she asked. I mean, there's probably a question mark. So why do you need she asked? But once again, like these are very minor quibbles. It's more like a question of style. If you choose to use them, fine, that's perfectly fine. But 3rd, let's talk about where I actually do agree with him. I think what Elmore Leonard is thinking of is bad dialogue tags. And a great example of this is action dialogue tags. That's just perfect. He winked. You can't wink words. It's an action. It's not something that you say. Or your hair is beautiful, he beamed. You don't beam words. You can't beam a line of dialogue. Things like he shrugged or he glared as dialogue tags. These things do not work. If you want to keep them, just in the dialogue and then just have it as a separate sentence. And the worst example of all time, drumroll, get the gun, he ejaculated. Please, for the love of God, never, never, never use that as a dialogue tag. I beg you. If you find that you are using she said or he said too often, the solution is not to find synonyms. The solution is to use fewer dialogue tags. tags. The problem is the number of dialogue tags, it's not the verb. I actually do not spend very much time on dialogue tags in my dialogue course because I think there's like 10,000 different things which are way more important about dialogue than, you know, he said, she said. But if you do want to take my course and find out, you should, because it's an amazing course. 4, never use an adverb to modify the verb said. He admonished gravely. Okay, I gotta admire Leonard for at least like poking fun at himself with that he admonished gravely. It's like in Strunk and White when they tell you, oh, never use these words, very, rather, little, and pretty. And then in the very next line, they use all 4 of those words. But for Leonard's advice, I would have to say it really depends on genre. Yes, if you're writing upmarket literary fiction, no, you should not use them. However, if you're writing romance, I would actually say readers want adverbs on their dialogue tags. Forever, he murmured huskily. My love, he declared smolderingly. I'm yours, she purred silkily. You're perfect, he breathed loin-firingly. Okay, maybe that last one went too far. But you get the point, right? In certain genres, readers actually like that stuff. 5, keep your exclamation points under control. You are allowed no more than 2 or 3 per 100,000 words of prose. Jeez, Leonard, you're getting a little strict with parceling out like the precise number we can use. But look, there are very famous writers who break this rule quite well. Look at Tom Wolfe in something like the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. I just picked a random page and counted the exclamation marks. Oh, there were 7 of them, which is more than what Leonard would say he should use for the entire book. But what Tom Wolfe ends up accomplishing with all those exclamation points is he conveys this enormous sense of like over-the-top energy. That book is a wild ride. Terry Pratchett also uses exclamation points really well, for example, in The Hogfather. Look at this example where just in 3 lines he uses 3 exclamation points. And what's more, one of the characters always talks in all caps, which kind of makes it sound like he's using exclamation points. In most fiction though, it is a good idea to use exclamation points measuredly, conservatively, and only when you really need them. And I will say one thing, that you should never use more than 1 exclamation point in a row. Like if you're using 6 exclamation points in a row, way over the top. Leonard Elmord's 6th piece of advice is never use the words suddenly or all hell broke loose. All right, I think you should ignore the specifics of this advice and pay attention to the deeper meaning. First, let's talk about the specifics. Maybe you use the word suddenly. Okay, that's all right. I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world. Is it always necessary? Well, no, it's not. And you should see, like, can you cut it and the sentence works better? Okay, then cut it. Or maybe you use a cliche like all hell broke loose. Okay, maybe you should see whether you can like cut it or use a different phrasing or something. But here's the deeper meaning of what he's saying here. You need to have a personal list of words and phrases that you absolutely refuse to use. Now, it doesn't need to be Elmore Leonard's list. Like, you can like the words suddenly or all hell broke loose. But there should be words and phrases that you really dislike and that you refuse to use in your own writing because it gives your writing a certain texture and sense of voice. His 7th rule is use regional dialect sparingly. Okay, I mean, tell that to Mark Twain. Here's Huckleberry Finn. Say, who is you? Where is you? Dog my cats if I didn't hear something. Or tell that to Zora Neale Hurston. I know exactly what I got to tell ya, but it's hard to know where to start at. Tell that to Irving Welsh. The sweat was lashing off a sick boy. He was trembling. Ignore my terrible accents and all of those. But is Leonard completely wrong? Well, I mean, no, because I do think misspellings make it a great deal harder for the reader to read. And I do say as a technique, misspellings to communicate dialect has fallen out of favor in the last 30 years. Most of the time, I think a better route to indicate dialect is through word choice and particularly syntax, like the very order of your words. And then if you want to use select misspellings, you can use those judiciously. So yes, dialect is something to be careful about and you don't want to go whole hog and make your book unreadable. 8, avoid detailed descriptions of characters. I do think very long descriptions of characters, it tends to be more commonplace in older books. So here's an example from Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness. I mean, it's a paragraph, right? And this wasn't even the longest example I can find. I could find other examples where it's like a really long paragraph, like double this size. I do think the more modern way to do character description is just to focus on 1 or 2 most salient details about the character. Like in 12 Long Months by Brian Malloy, he says, with her hair dyed bright red, she looks like Ronald McDonald's postmenopausal sister, who has let herself go. So it's a much quicker description, right? And ultimately, this is just something that comes down to pace. Do you want a slower pace for your novel? Is that the pace of the entire novel? Okay, well then you have enough time to do a lengthier character description. Or do you want a much faster pace? In that case, Sure, trim down those character descriptions, make them really neat and snappy. Elmore Leonard's 9th writing rule is don't go into great detail describing places and things. Okay, this is a little suspect. I mean, there are a good amount of writers out there that actually want a lot of detail. I mean, this is an older example, but think of like Victor Hugo, the Hunchback of Notre Dame. In his chapter, A Bird's Eye View of Paris, the entire chapter just describes Paris. That's the whole chapter. That's all it is. And you can probably list in the comments like amazing description passages that you guys read in some books that maybe were quite lengthy, but somehow it was still really pleasurable for you. On the other hand, yes, there are readers who want a much faster pace and will give up on your book if you have really lengthy description passages. I'm thinking of the book Dark Matter by Blake Crouch, which was actually just made into a television series. His prose is so stripped and so economical. It's like Hemingway married Raymond Chandler. And for a lot of people, that stripped down prose is exactly the type of book that they want to read. So I think the lesson for this one is to know your audience. Do they want lengthy description or do they want really tight economical description? And Elmore Leonard's last writing rule is try to leave out the part that readers tend to skip. Okay, this piece of advice I actually find funny, right? Because what readers are we talking about? Different readers tend to skip different things, right? It's not like readers are this monolithic block. There are lots of different types of readers. And also this is kind of a glib phrase like, oh, leave out the bad parts. Okay, awesome. I don't think that's super helpful actually. But if we really drill down to what he meant, I think what he means is don't be boring. I mean, I can agree with that. The question is whether it's super helpful writing advice. I think not. Really, what I think he's doing here is he's targeting description again, which makes this the third anti-description piece of writing advice in these list of rules. But I think even dialogue, which according to him, I think would probably be the most unskippable stuff. I mean, it's really brief, it's really easy for the eye to read. No reader skips dialogue, right? But I think even dialogue can be skippable if it's really boring or badly written. So instead of saying don't write description, I would say it's better to say don't write description badly. So one, your description shouldn't just deliver information like a conveyor belt, it should entertain with the description, or it could build character, or it could forward the plot. Like there's lots of stuff that description can do well. And then my second piece of advice is you don't have to cluster all the description together in one big chunk. I mean, yeah, that does make it a little bit harder to read. Have that same amount of description, but if you spread it out over an entire conversation, or over a chapter, or over several chapters, suddenly it becomes much easier to read. I hope that was all helpful, and I put a link to the dialogue course in the description below, so please check it out.